This year, I have a very important resolution. Losing weight has proven unsuccessful for the past decade? So I figure why not hone my willpower on something we can all benefit from, like replaying Spider-Man movie tie-in games from 6 years ago. We'd all enjoy that, right? You may be asking who in their right mind would play The Amazing Spider-Man 2, let alone make a video on it, when we have the banger that is Marvel's Spider-Man. Plus, that other infinitely more talented dude, Gojira Mandalorian, did it like 4 years ago. There's a very simple answer to that.
Peter? Don't leave me.
There's no doubt that the biggest aspect most people look forward to when jumping into a Spider-Man game is web swinging. These mechanics have been on a weird roller coaster ever since Spider-Man 2 blew the doors open with its revolutionary physics-based web swinging. It feels like web swinging mechanics took a step back with one entry, then another step back, then a step forward. So where does The Amazing Spider-Man 2 place? This game's web swinging mechanics are the most dull. Sure, Beanox responded to the complaints of web lines not sticking to anything in the first Amazing Spider-Man game. Call me weird, but I think that first game's choice felt in place with the rest of the game's design. Having the web line stick to buildings in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 doesn't really do all that much. It's serviceable, but it feels like a cheap imitation of mechanics that have been done much better in previous entries. Its attempt at innovation is having each trigger correspond to Spider-Man's left and right hand, which would add a layer of intricacy if web swinging didn't feel so safe and flat. There's little to no punishment for using the wrong hand with the absence of fall damage, and the lack of any real sense of speed or momentum eliminates the incentive to give traversing your best effort. The web rush concept sounds cool on paper, seeing the city through the lenses of Spider-Man while everything around you slows down and allows you to pinpoint exactly where you want to leap to. But when executed, it ends up bringing the game's pace to a grinding halt. The transition between the third-person view to first-person takes a second too long, and aiming Spider-Man's silhouette representing where you'll land often feels awkward. It works during the slower-paced stealth sections, but even during those instances, I don't feel like I'm effortlessly bouncing around the room with the grace and swiftness Spider-Man should have. While we're talking stealth, this is one aspect TASM 2 does pretty well. Stealth has peered its sneaky head into Spider-Man games in the past, and with the noir levels from Shattered Dimensions aside, TASM 2 has the best incorporation of stealth in a traditional Spider-Man game. Enemy line of sights are represented well, and taking out these thugs from numerous positions and vantage points is satisfying. What's not so satisfying is TASM 2's combat system. This game came out during the time where Spider-Man games tried to emulate Arkham's free-flow combat. While some games succeeded in taking the free-flow combat and adding a bit of their own flavor, TASM 2 again feels like a cheap knockoff. It lacks the fluidity and rhythm that makes clearing out a gang of 15 goons without taking a hit satisfying. The essential parts are there. A prompt in the form of Spider-Man's spider sense signaling you when you can counter an attack, and the ability to bounce back and forth between enemies. But Spidey's movements feel so jerky and sporadic, and not in the sense where it might have been intentional as to adapt his fast and unpredictable fighting style from the comics, but more that the developers didn't have time to create something enticing, and instead spruce something up that would be functional at the least. Clearing up a room of guys feels like a chore when you're mindlessly mashing the attack button with the occasional dodge input. You do encounter special enemy types that require you to use one of Spider-Man's gadgets or special web fluid, but it feels something more like, oh yeah, I gotta do this one thing for a second before I can continue mashing square. The worst offense is that this also applies to the game's bosses, the one place that you would expect to introduce something that breaks up the monotony of combat by having a unique gimmick. But it all boils down to the same brain-dead clobbering. I went pretty much my whole playthrough ignoring upgrades besides the ones that the game mandates you to get. These gadgets and upgrades should act as an extension of combat that allows the player to experiment with different applications for them. Instead, it feels like an afterthought. The open world nature and mission structure of TASM 2 are constantly at odds with each other. The correlation between them feels like there's a 10-foot thick wall of steel separating the two. What I mean is when you start a mission, it instantly feels like you're disjointed from the open world. And that's not to say indoor levels ruin the design of Spider-Man games. I absolutely love when linear and more structured levels have a place in Spider-Man games. But missions that are set in the open streets of Manhattan lack seamless integration, which is important in making missions in open world games feel like a natural part of it. The second you start up a mission, it feels like you've started a simulation within the game. This is the case with side missions and random crimes as well, which is no doubt attributed to the overabundance of loading screens and short cutscenes that play when starting a side mission. I find it bizarre that you have to start up random crimes and events. Something as simple as fighting thugs in an alley or stopping a car chase. Crimes that have been seamlessly integrated into the open world in previous Spider-Man games, going as far back as the game that started it all. Having side missions be naturally occurring in the moment-to-moment gameplay is a huge part of Spider-Man games. It plays into making you feel like a superhero that's watching over the city and swoops in just in the nick of time and save the day. TASM 2 would have benefited from just going all in on a linear approach. There are some indoor levels that are genuinely designed pretty well, and there could still be levels set in the open streets of Manhattan. It's been done before. The open map in this game serves little to no purpose besides dropping icons to start up missions and collecting scattered comic book pages, which admittedly is pretty addicting. But it also contains the most annoying feature in this game, the hero/menace system. This system single-handedly manages to shoot my stress level through the roof, which I guess you could say does a good job of putting you in the boots of Spider-Man, as I'm sure he also feels the same level of stress. But I really could have done without this system. If you're a good little spider and tend to your city's needs of stopping crimes and saving lives, you've got nothing to worry about. But really, these side missions and crimes get repetitive really fast, so I wouldn't blame you for turning a blind eye. You fraud. But if you do so, prepare to feel the wrath of drones, shield barriers, and armored mercs. They're not the most threatening opponents, you can take them out really easy. They're more of a severe annoyance. As crappy as the web swinging mechanics are in this game, it's still the place of peace and serenity fans of Spider-Man games come to feel comfortable in. Well, get ready to work for that tranquility, hero. So what about its story? Does TASM 2 derive from its cinematic counterpart? Absolutely. No, the game doesn't necessarily adapt the storyline from the movie. Max Dillon gets a total of maybe 10 minutes of screen time, and his transformation into Electro is done completely off screen. Gwen Stacy, a crucial character in the TASM movies and the first game, is completely absent. So what I meant when I said that the game derives from the movie is that the game also tries to juggle way too many subplots, and none of them get enough development or a satisfying conclusion. TASM 2 decides to double back and starts by picking up a plot point from the first movie, where Peter's trying to track down Uncle Ben's killer. I thought this was a bizarre choice given that the first game told its own unique story set after the events of the first movie. So I was expecting TASM 2 to go the same route. In a way, I guess you can say they did since they focus a lot more on the villains they introduce, but it results in a jumbled mess where you have plot elements from the first movie, new characters for the game, and the plot from TASM 2 that's frantically stuffed in the last moments of the game. The game takes an interesting direction with Kraven the Hunter. He takes the role of a father figure to Peter for a brief moment. He tries to train Peter to become a better warrior, but Peter resists when his moral code is challenged. But again, this subplot, while interesting, feels half-baked and gets abruptly cut short. For being the last hurrah of Spider-Man movie tie-in games, TASM 2 goes out with a sad whimper. And even more tragic since Beanox started off really strong with Shattered Dimensions. Sure, some of the ones that followed weren't the biggest hits, but we know that they had the capability. I'm not putting it on Beanox. I'm sure a lot of the game's shortcomings were a result of budget constrictions and a rushed development cycle, but it was the end of an era for Spider-Man games. And even though we've moved on to big budget AAA games with Marvel's Spider-Man and Marvel's Avengers on the way, Spider-Man movie games will never be forgotten.